Am I recording? Hello, it's me again, Chaz, making another video. This one, it's about how many of the original 13 teams that competed at the 1930 World Cup do I think will qualify for the 2026 World Cup. Now, two of those nations that competed at the very first World Cup, both from the CONCACAF, Mexico and the USA, are both co-hosting the World Cup together along with Canada. They qualify automatically for the next World Cup. The USA will be hosting the World Cup second time, and Mexico will be hosting the World Cup for the third time, making Mexico the very first nation to ever host the World Cup 3 different times. The 2026 World Cup would also be the very first World Cup that 3 nations will host. Mexico hosted the 1970 World Cup and the 1986 World Cup, and the USA hosted the 1994 World Cup. 94 was the last time the World Cup was hosted in this region. This is also the first time that Canada would host the World Cup. So those two were the very first 2 nations in the CONCACAF, both USA and Mexico, to compete at the World Cup. They both played in the openers. France beat Mexico 4-1. USA, on the other hand, they defeated Belgium 3-0. The USA reached the semi-finals, losing to Argentina 6-1. Mexico, on the other hand, failed to get out of their group. They finished bottom of their group. In the FIFA rankings of the 1930 World Cup, the USA ended up 3rd, while Mexico ended up last, 13th. Both nations would like to obviously improve on where they did at the last World Cup. The 1930 World Cup was USA's best performance at a World Cup and is the best performance of any nation in a CONCACAF having a chance to actually lift the title. Mexico do reach the quarterfinals of other World Cups, both the ones that they hosted in 1970 and 86, but they've never reached beyond the quarterfinals. The CONMEBOL nations in the South America region made up majority of the nations that competed at the 1930 World Cup, 7 to be exact. In the next World Cup in 2026, a total of 7 nations possibly could compete at the next World Cup. South America, the CONMEBOL, have 6 spots guaranteed and a potential 7th spot through the playoffs. As mentioned in the past, Uruguay were the hosts of the 1930 World Cup, and currently they are 3rd in the CONMEBOL's table, which would mean they will have a spot and qualify for the next World Cup in 2026. The finals in 1930 was between Uruguay and Argentina. Uruguay won that one. Argentina are the current World Cup holders. They also are the holder of the Copa America. Currently, they are top of the standings in the CONMEBOL's World Cup table, which again would mean they would qualify for the next World Cup. These 2 nations, as the winner and runner-up, were ranked number 1 and 2 in the 1930 FIFA World Cup rankings. Uruguay haven't reached the final since 1930, though they did win the World Cup again in 1950. Argentina has won the World Cup themselves 3 times, and as mentioned, are the current holders. Another team that competed at the very first World Cup was Brazil, who currently are the most successful team at the World Cup, winning 5. They are currently in 5th in the CONMEBOL World Cup qualifying table. This would mean they would just about get a automatic spot for the World Cup. They would qualify in 5th. They were ranked 6th in the 1930 World Cup standings ranking, not being able to get out their group. They finished 2nd in a group of 3, 2nd to Yugoslavia. Now, on the opposite scale of the World Cup CONMEBOL table, we have Peru, Chile, Bolivia, and Paraguay. All four of those nations are a part of the original 13. They make up the rest of the South American nations to compete at World Cup, but at the current standings, only Paraguay would have a chance to compete at the next World Cup, being in 7th, but that would be in a playoff position. So as it stands, Bolivia, Chile, and Peru would all be out and not qualify for the 2026 World Cup if it was to stay this way. In 1930, Peru and Bolivia both finished bottom of their group, not getting a point. Paraguay was second in their group, behind the USA, while Chile was also second in their group, but they were behind Argentina. Back then, only one team in each group could qualify for the semi-finals of the World Cup. Chile, were outside of Argentina and Uruguay, were the highest ranked South American team, finishing 5th on the FIFA rankings. Out of these four nations, Chile has hosted the World Cup, and that was also their best performance at the World Cup, where they finished in the semi-final. They lost to Brazil in the semi-finals. Brazil went on to win that final, but Chile did win the playoffs and finished 3rd. Peru, their best performance at a World Cup was the 1970 World Cup, hosted by Mexico, where they finished in the quarterfinals. They lost to Brazil 4-2. Paraguay as well, like Peru, has reached the quarterfinals of the World Cup. That was in 2010 in South Africa. Bolivia, on the other hand, has not got out of the group stage. The last World Cup they qualified for was the 1994 World Cup in USA. So as it stands, those nations, they are not in the best position to qualify for the 2026 World Cup. Okay, so that was the Americas, both North and South America, and where those nations currently are for the 2026 World Cup qualifiers. Again, 2 of them are hosts, Mexico and the USA. 3 of those nations are in automatic World Cup qualifying places. That's Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. 1 of those nations are in a playoff position, that is Paraguay, while 3 of those nations, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, are not in qualifying positions for the World Cup. Now we'll move on to the 4 nations that make up the rest of the original 13. All 4 of these nations are European nations, part of UEFA. So the Eurozone, UEFA zone, hasn't started their World Cup qualifiers yet. The draw will be in December, and the actual kickoff for the qualifiers will start, I believe, in March of next year. One of the 4 nations no longer exists. That's Yugoslavia, who lost to Uruguay in the semi-finals of the very first World Cup. Now, Yugoslavia made up a lot of different countries, but FIFA only recognizes one as their successor, and that's Serbia. Serbia didn't have the greatest Euros this year, not getting out of the group stage. They finished bottom of their group. As Yugoslavia, they do go on to finish in 4th again, this time in the 1962 World Cup. Chile were the hosts of that World Cup. That's who Chile beat to finish 3rd. But as Serbia, since then, they have failed to get out of the group stage past 4 World Cups that they competed in. And Belgium was another nation that competed at the very first World Cup. They finished bottom of their group, though, and failed to get points. They were in the same group as the USA and Paraguay. Their best performance, the 2018 World Cup in Russia, where they finished third. They lost to France in the semi-finals. France went on to winning that World Cup. And speaking of France, France is also another nation that competed at the very first World Cup. They are part of the original 13, as mentioned. France has won the World Cup 2 times after this World Cup and hosted it twice as well. 1938 and then in 1998, where they did win the World Cup. They again went on to win the World Cup in 2018. Though they had a good start in the 1930 World Cup, having the very first goal scorer at the World Cup and won the first games, beating Mexico 4-1. They failed to beat Chile and Argentina. Didn't actually score past any of those nations and ended up finishing third in their group. In the Euros this year, they were knocked out by Spain. Spain went on to win in the competition. And finally, Romania. In 1930, they were in the same group as the hosts and winners of that tournament, Uruguay. They had 2 points. They won 1 game against Peru, but failed to beat Uruguay. Since then, Romania has qualified for a few more World Cups, both in 1934 and 38. Their best performance was, funny enough, in the USA in 1994, where they reached the quarterfinals. They haven't competed at a World Cup since 1998 in France. During the Euros this year, they reached a round of 16 where they were beaten by the Netherlands 3-0. So that's the original 13 nations who competed at the very first World Cup and where they currently are in their campaigns for the 2026 World Cup. As mentioned, 2 have already qualified because they're hosts, Mexico and USA. They were the only 2 nations of the CONCACAF that competed at that World Cup. The UEFA zone hasn't started yet, and one of those nations no longer exists, but I will focus on the successor team, and that's Serbia. That leaves the CONMEBOL now, which is the only zone that has started their World Cup campaign. As it stands, I personally feel that more than half of the original 13 nations will compete at the 2026 World Cup. Let's have a look at the CONMEBOL table. So Argentina on top, Uruguay 3rd and Brazil 5th. As it stands, all 3 of those nations will qualify. I believe Bolivia or Paraguay will get one of those automatic spots, and one of those other nations between Paraguay and Bolivia will get the other spot. So let's say 6 and 7, I think Paraguay and Bolivia will finish. And I think in the playoffs, one of those nations will get that spot. And finally, I think France and Romania will get those spots. I don't think Serbia is the successor team to Yugoslavia. And I actually, going on a bold one, I actually don't think Belgium, depends what group they're put in, of course, but I think Belgium might be that shock team that may not qualify for the next World Cup. Again, the UEFA zone hasn't started yet. We'll see when the draw comes out, and obviously next year when the matches start being played. So that's 9 of the original 13, I believe, will play at the next World Cup. 2 are already guaranteed, Mexico and USA. So let's say those nations again who I think will qualify. That's USA, Mexico as hosts, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, France, and Romania. Those are the 9 of the 13 nations I believe will play at the next World Cup in 2026. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. And bye.